Hey, everybody. This is Nevin Gusak, your host, the Populist Patriot. I'm back home. Just taking my daughter back to her house from circus practice. She's a little bit about her. If any of you have seen Cirque du Soleil, she does the Lyra and Silks. She's been doing that for over 2 years. She's amazing and fantastic. I always take her home to her mom's, and it's just great to see her. But anyways, I'm back home. Enough of the co-parenting thing, although I can't hide my proud feelings for my daughter. But anyways, tonight, one of the things I promised that I'd talk about is some of the new things that I've researched, some new books and articles and news of the day. So this video I'm going to talk about is about North Korean-Cuban relations. So it was this book that I recently came across by Andrea Berger, published in the year 2017, called Target Markets, North Korea's Military Customers. And what was interesting is some of the factual information here in this book, whereas it showed that North Korea and Cuba were unsurprisingly very close politically, economically, and militarily. As Raul Castro said in 1968, he was the deputy premier at the time and is now the president of, for decades have been the minister of the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Cuba. So he said in 1968, if someone is interested in what the Cubans' opinion is on certain questions, he should ask the North Koreans. And if someone asks what Korea's standpoint may be in certain cases, he can safely ask the Cubans about that. Our views are completely identical in everything. So that pretty much has summed up the relations since the Castro's communist takeover, the 26th of July movement in January 1959. Zhou Enlai, who was then the premier of Communist China in 1960, encouraged Che Guevara to ask North Korea for military advice. And Zhou Enlai stated to Che, talk to them to see what secret defensive works could be constructed in mountainous areas. A former Cuban intelligence officer has suggested that while the Cubans did indeed study North Korean operations during the Korean War, they did not receive military hardware. Although, starting in 1991, there is evidence, both from the Washington Times article as published by Bill Gertz in November of 1991, the North Koreans provided military hardware to the Cuban armed forces, including long-range artillery pieces. And in 2013, there was at least one Cuban maritime merchant vessel that was intercepted, and it was caught with weapons as well as spare parts for aircraft, tanks, and artillery pieces, and that was headed to North Korea. So there has been exchanges of military hardware on both sides. According to archival documents from 1967, at the request of the Cuban government, North Korea agreed to send a group of up to 700 volunteers with weapons and equipment to Cuba. So even as early as the 1960s, there was a military connection between North Korea and Cuba. However, let's see. North Korea also filled in the gaps whenever the Soviets were unwilling or unable to provide even more weapons in the 1980s. North Korea delivered the hardware requested, along 100,000 AK-47s, along with tens of millions of rounds of ammunition. And in fact, as Fidel Castro recounted, they did not charge us a cent, supposedly. In 1986, North Korea and Cuba signed a 20-year cooperation agreement with a military component in 1986. More recently, there have been unusually frequent and high-ranking exchanges of Cuban and North Korean military delegations. In November 2010, then Chief of the Korean People's Army of North Korea, General Staff Ri Yong-ho, visited Cuba for meetings with senior Cuban military representatives. He also toured Cuban defense industry sites, with one photograph showing him inspecting a GAZ-51 engine. GAZ is Russian military-produced jeeps, which is used in light armored vehicles. In September 2012, the Vice Minister of the Cuban Revolutionary Armed Forces traveled to Pyongyang, which is the capital of North Korea, with an accompanying military delegation. He was separately taken to an exhibition of North Korean military equipment. Then in June 2013, Kim Kyok-sik, Ri's successor as the chief of the Korean People's Army General Staff, led an army delegation to Cuba consisting of over a dozen officers. During his stay, he met with the Cuban president, Prime Minister and Vice Minister of the Revolutionary Armed Forces, the latter who had been in Pyongyang a year earlier. Kim discussed, quote, boosting the friendly relations between the two armies and visited numerous Cuban military units, including the Grand Rescue Tank Unit. And we already talked about in 2013, the North Korean vessel, the Chongshan Gang, was shipping weapons from Cuba to North Korea. It avoided passing the Panama Canal, and it was found to contain 25 containers with Cuban military equipment, including 2 anti-aircraft missile complexes, 9 missiles and spares and parts, engines for tanks, artillery pieces, engines, and other parts for various Russian-made MiG aircraft. And in fact, the same book also mentioned that between 2000 and 2010, Putin's Russia was exporting spare parts and outright military weapons to the Cubans. So much for the end of the Cold War. And in fact, there was a Heritage Foundation, and I have, of course, serious issues with the Heritage Foundation, but they're good on some of the defense issues and the threats of Russia and China, the threat of Russia. And even in 1992, there was a Heritage Foundation report which indicated that Cuba continued to receive Russian-made military hardware, heavy weapons, through the port of Mariel. And then also it reported that in the 2000s that the communist China also exported several shipments of weapons to the Cubans too as well, which I talk about in volume 1 of my book, Turning the Page. So that concludes that little piece of information that I found from my research, and I'd like to do this periodically with the things that I find. This way I can share this information with everyone in the audience here. Thank you all for listening. More will be coming in a few moments.